There. That's the one thing I usually forget to do is to hit record. So we will turn on PowerPoint and get it to slideshow from beginning. Display settings. We'll do that in a second. I've got to then get to sharing screens. And here are people with us already. Share screen. Here we are. All right, gradually getting there. Hello to everyone on screen. Are you online seeing the screen all right? Callie, are you seeing the screen? Oh, lovely. Okay. And there we go. All right. So we've got Susan and Callie watching. We're recording for posterity and a few people who can't be here today. That'll be posted later in the day. But why don't we go around and give our names? Oh, here comes Jim Grice. So let's give him a minute. Well, Jim, you know, it's psychic distance for him more than geographical. It's nice to have you all here. So why don't we go around the room and say who we are? You probably know me already.
Thank you.
Richard,
Yes.
can folks speak up?
Yeah. Well.
Okay, never mind.
Okay. She's on her way. Okay. We are starting today to look at the revelation to John. No matter what anyone might say, there is no book in the Bible called Revelation. There is no book in the Bible called Revelations. There is no book of Revelations. The title in the Greek, as you will, all of you Greek scholars will see there, is the Apocalypsis Ioannou, which means the Apocalypse of John. We don't know which John it was. John was not an uncommon name in the first century. After all, in the Bible, we have John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. We also probably have John who wrote the epistles of John, probably not the same John the Gospels are attributed to. And then this John. Somehow the Johns all got lumped together, even though if you read the Apocalypse, you will find a very different style of writing than the gospel, and the writings in the letters are different from the gospel and this. So the question of whether this is, which John this is, are we meant to think that it's the apostle? We don't know. He just says his name's John at the beginning. This we need to remember when we look at a Bible, that the Bible, and I'm sorry I don't have one bound in leather with gold edges, that the Bible did not descend from heaven, bound in black leather with gold edges and a gold cross on the front. It is not a book, but a collection of ancient literature. And some of it going back in fragmentary form, probably to at least the second millennium before Christ. And the last little bits of it, probably the Revelation to John may well be the last one written at the end of the 1st century after the birth of Christ. Different authors, different styles, and as we'll see, as we look at things today, talking about background, different ways of imagining life, different ways of imagining God and the relationship to God. So, when, this is John J.W.H. Reese was one of my New Testament professors. And he was famous for his aphorisms. One was, it must have meant something to them, or they wouldn't have put it in the book now, would they? And so it was put in the book, but we don't know when or why. We assume that it was written in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. The thing about the development of the Bible is that there are ancient books that were left out of the Bible that were used by the church. A book called The Shepherd of Hermas, which is was an early important document in the life of the church, purported to be a vision that a fellow named Hermas had when an angel named the shepherd appeared to him and took him to heaven. And they loved it in the early church because it was the only book that described heaven. And if you think you're going to be going to heaven, you want to know, will I need a sweater? Can I use a bathing suit? And for those who are interested, rolling green fields, actually relying apparently very much on the Greek or Roman view of the Elysian fields. But that didn't wind up in the Bible. The revelation to John may well have almost not gotten in, and we're not privy to the discussions people have, but there are some early important theologians as late as the 4th century who in their entire body of work never refer to the revelation to John. So, and a lot of our sense of how the Bible developed comes from looking at quotations from books of the Bible that are used in early Christian writing. And so this may well have been a controversial book because it was seen as perhaps a little bit too wild. But it must have meant something to them, or they wouldn't have put in the book now, would they? Thank you, Father Rees. What is an apocalypse? Well, the Greek word apocalypsis comes from 2 words, apo, which means away from or negating, and kalypsis, which means a veil. Anyone here ever have to read the Odyssey when you were in school? Okay. In the Odyssey, the follow-up to the Iliad, outside of the Bible, the Iliad and the Odyssey, plus the Homeric hymns, were the most sacred books in the ancient Near East or ancient Mediterranean. But in the Odyssey, it's all about Odysseus coming home from the Trojan War, a trip that should have taken him a few days, but he managed to tick off the gods. So they kept him wandering around for 10 years. And much of that time, he was on an island with a nymph named Calypso, apparently having a high old time. But a calypsis, Calypso was the veiled one. Think of a waterfall that you're trying to see through. All right, well, so imagine that this is a veil. We are going to apo the calypsis. And so an apocalypse is a document that's supposed to take the veil away, to reveal that which has been hidden. And often, and there are extra biblical apocalypses, the books of Esdras and others. There are biblical apocalypses, second half of the book of Daniel, some little apocalypse and gospels, and this work that attempt to lift off the veil to show what God is doing in history. And we'll get into the strategies of apocalypse as we move down the line. But when we look at the Bible, when we read the Bible, we think we're looking at this. This is a reconstruction of a dinosaur. It is fully realized. You can see that this is a very active, energetic dinosaur. It's a very modern dinosaur, although now, if they were doing a really up-to-date one, they'd probably give it some feathers. This is all based on taking archaeological records and putting them together with imagination and coming up with a picture. 100 years ago or so, this would have been a much slower, less energetic beast. But with the help of modern paleontologists and the Jurassic Park movies, this is what we think we're seeing when we think of dinosaurs. Some of us may have actually seen this, which is a reconstruction of the skeleton of a dinosaur. And you'll notice that this one, like this one, only has 1 foot on the ground. They really want us to think that this is an energetic dinosaur, muscular, fast-moving, and it's got a different posture than we might see. Earlier, they would have had it sort of very upright, but here you've got this posture. But what we actually have to look at is this. This is the fossil record. And admittedly, this is not in situ. This is not like out in the Arizona desert. This is, right next to the coffee shop in a museum. So even this is somewhat artificial. But this is a jumble of bones embedded in rock. And whenever we open the Bible, in a sense, we're looking at a fossil record, because what we have, well, let's go back here. What we have are the words of the text, the bare words. We don't live in the same culture that they did. Our political system, our view of how the world works, our view of how the universe is structured is entirely different. We don't have the voices, we don't have the accents, we don't have the smells. We experience climate in a different way. Imagine if we, to do this, if we were starting this up in July and sitting in here without air conditioning, but with the windows open. So much of what happens to us when we read the Bible is moving from this to this. Let's say this is a scholarly restructuring of the fossils, to this, where we have the imagination brought into play. There is a history of interpretation of the Bible that has become as canonical, as legitimate in the minds of most people as the text. Now, before some recent works of the last 15 or 20 years, if people had asked you, what was Mary Magdalene's profession? Most of you would have said she's a prostitute, which is not what the Bible tells us. In the Bible, Mary Magdalene is a woman out of whom Jesus cast 7 devils. And she is one of the women who followed him, supported him, and she is the only woman who is present in all of the gospel accounts of the resurrection. And in John, she's the only woman who goes to the tomb. In the other gospels, it may be 3 women or a horde of women who go to the tomb. But in sometime, the earliest record we have of this is the 6th century. It may have happened earlier, but the earliest record we have of Mary Magdalene being referred to as a prostitute is a sermon by Pope Sixtus, who lived in the 6th century. I remember that because Sixtus VI, who preached a sermon where he took Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair, and the one prostitute in the Gospels who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and anointed them. Or actually, it's Mary of Lazarus who anointed them. The other woman dried them with her hair. And he put them into one person. And from that point on, the thought of Mary as a prostitute, and hence Mary as the ideal penitent, became a central feature of Christian preaching. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, you get these wonderful things. There's this, a whole school of German wood carving of saints, and you'll often see Mary Magdalene with this face emerging from a mass of hair that just covers her whole body, because long hair is a symbol of penitence. So here she is, just all hair because she's all penitence. But it's not the biblical story, and yet think of how get up to Jesus Christ Superstar, where, Mary is Jesus' prostitute girlfriend. We have a canonized interpretation. And so it is always important to try to remember that and to understand that our sense of what's going on may be actually dependent more on other people's interpretation of the text than the text itself. Okay. A lot of our interpretation of the Revelation to John relies on a school of thought that began in the 19th century. And hey, Bob, began in the 19th century and continues to the present. There was a guy named John Nelson Darby. How many people have ever heard of John Darby? Okay. How many people here have heard of the rapture, when Jesus is going to come down before the tribulation and take everybody out, all the Christians out of the world and save them from the tribulation? You can thank John Nelson Darby for that, because John Nelson Darby is the father of a school of thought called dispensationalism, which includes a premillennial interpretation of what happens to Christians. Dispensationalism, which was codified in a work called Dispensational Truth, several generations after Darby, basically says that the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the Revelation to John, the first part of the book, are descriptions of 7 ages of the church leading up to the current age, which is the age when Jesus is going to come back. Premillennial, because Christians need to be taken out of the world so that all the nasty things can happen. Jesus can come back and win, and then we'll have 1,000 years of happy times. This, which became a sort of this looks archaic because it was done in 1920. It was a bestseller. In the days before the internet, salesmen for dispensational truth would travel the country, and they had pages like these. And dispensational truth was a book that was, this big by this big, and you'd open it up, and these broad pages with these illustrations, and they had huge wooden signs, and they would show you page by page what the dispensational truth was and give you a lecture about it, and then they'd sell you the book at the end. So a sort of early marketing thing. And then in 1977, Hal Lindsey, who's still alive, wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, in which he took John Nelson Darby's view of what was going on and what was happening in the world then. And he said that the foundation of the state of Israel in 1949 was the start of a 30-year countdown until the end of the world. And as we all know, the world ended in 1979 and Jesus came back, and we've all been happy ever since, right? Okay. One of the things that happens when people codify what's going on in the Bible, and what they tend to do is take the apocalyptic literature, second half of the book of Daniel, apocalyptic references in Paul and the Gospels and the Revelation to John, and weave them into one hopefully coherent story. One of the great games throughout the history of the world or the church was to try to figure out who the Antichrist was. Now, in the Bible, there is no the Antichrist. The writer of the letters of John speaks of the spirit of Antichrist, and there's a character in the Revelation to John called the beast, and those get blended together. And so who's the Antichrist? Was Genghis Khan the Antichrist? A lot of people thought he was. Was Napoleon Bonaparte the Antichrist? A lot of English people thought he was. Perhaps, and I once had a gospel tract that demonstrated that Spiro Agnew was the Antichrist, which I have a soft spot in my heart for that, but that got lost in a move. I used to keep a file which I labeled religious pornography, where I kept interesting bits and pieces of religious effluvia. But so for Hal Lindsey, it was the foundation of the state of Israel, the foundation of the common market. You all remember the common market, and other things. And for years, he's 92 now. I doubt he's still doing, but he had a TV show where he would sit behind a news desk and he would take news about Israel and say, aha, you see, this is what it's doing. But you'll notice that once we got past 1979, he kept doing it. It's just the events that are proving prophecy change over time, so that he can keep talking about it. There was a fellow by the name of Miller, I forget his first name, who was a Baptist minister in the mid-19th century, who mathematically figured out, based on all sorts of things in his interpretation of the Bible, that the world was going to end in October of 1844. Early October, basically Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year, because that's the anniversary of the creation of the world. And that, so he convinced any number of people in New England, and New England in the mid-19th century was the Southern California of America. They called it the burned out area because it had had so many revivals that you needed a really wild belief to catch people's attention. But Miller caught people's attention. And so in early 1844, all sorts of people wrapped themselves in white sheets and went up on the hilltops to wait for Jesus to come back. And of course, we know that he did, and they all got taken away. And that was the end of the world. But it didn't happen. So Miller sat down. That is known in history as the Millerite Great Disappointment. But Miller sat down and recalculated, and he discovered I'm a year off. So the next year in October, a smaller group of people went up on the hilltops, and I don't know how long he carried on, but his work survives in the Seventh-day Adventist Church because the Adventists came out of the Millerite movement. So this happens. Okay, so we even get eventually, once we get past all of this, to the fictionalization of this, where the common understanding of what's going to happen to the end of the world becomes a series of 11 novels. Very popular. It says over 9 million sold of the first one. But you've got to imagine, in terms of putting the flesh on the bones, to use my dinosaur metaphor, that in the Left Behind novels, there's a whole lot of Tom Clancy in there. Very effective, kind of military-minded people driving around in big vehicles and doing stuff. So very successful. But again, it really is more this than this, or in fact, than this. So we're going to move way back before the revelation to John. And today, I want to do a sort of background on how through the Bible, people encountered God, and how that is shown in the literature, how that developed, and how you would get to, from the earliest stories of encounters with God up through visionary encounters with God, and ultimately apocalyptic encounters with God. So this is going to take up rest of our time today. But before we get into that, are there any questions that anybody has? Okay. All right, so let's, well, yeah, that's the text. Let's go back to some very old things in the Bible. In the story of the Garden of Eden, first of all, we have two creation accounts. And in the first creation account, God does not get his hands dirty. And in fact, there's a New Testament Jewish biblical scholar, Amy Jill Levine, who says that the account in Genesis 1 is almost like God dancing with the creation. It's said because God always says, let there be, and things emerge based on the word that God speaks. There's a bit of a separation between God and the created order. Up until the creation of humanity, let us make man and woman in our image. In the second creation account in Genesis 2 and 3, God gets his hands dirty. God reaches down in the mud and molds the mud man, Adam, the earth guy. And then he pulls Hawa, the woman, out of Adam's side. God is directly involved. And in fact, when God comes down for a visit, you can hear him walking. His feet rustle through the grass, twigs break. And so the sense of the presence of God, as we'll see through some of these, what I would call old, early stories, really is the sense of someone who appears like a person. And in fact, I think, and this is my own personal heresy, a lot of our sense of God is shaped by our own living and worshiping experience. And so our worshiping experience is very different from a 28 prayer book worshiping experience. Our image of God is less that of a British monarch, which you get in the older prayer book, and different now. but in ancient Canaan, when people went to worship, the priest would speak for God. And so in a sense, when you would go to a Canaanite shrine, the priest would be wearing vestments, would sort of put on a God suit. And if you came to hear about what your crops would be like, the priest would, in the voice of God, say, you're going to have a good season. You're going to have good crops. So when we have these stories in Genesis of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and God appearing to them in a very human form, it's because they were used to the idea that if you went somewhere, you would get a word from God through a person. So we have God walking in the garden. And then when we get in the Abraham story, the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. He saw 3 men. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant, and so on. And in the course of this, and I put the Rublev Trinity just to show how this has been interpreted as the coming of the blessed and glorious Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the 3 of them, to meet Abraham under the oaks of Mamre. Although there's a kind of separation, because as we go further, Abraham actually gets into an argument with God. You know, they go to the hilltop and look down on Sodom and Gomorrah, and God says, I'm going to wipe them out. The Lord says this, and Abraham says, far be it from me to argue with you, but, you know, you're supposed to be just and righteous. What if, are you going to kill everybody down there? What if there are 100 good people down there? And, you know, I once heard this read by a guy who made it sound like a car salesman or something. But, you know, he finally gets down to, if, you know, there are only 10 or 5 or whatever, he's going to save it. And, you know, it's not going to work out. But this trio breaks up, and 2 of them go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're not quite sure what happens to the 3rd, but it is very much, you know, they eat with Abram. They have some lamb and some bread. It's funny because later, and you have to understand that in sacrifice, people didn't just sacrifice an animal to God and go away. A part of that was given to God, burned on the altar, but they took the rest and they made a meal. And the eating of that meal was part of the worship. By the time you get to the book of Judges, you have an angel who comes who seems very much like an angel. I mean, like a man. But yet when the meal is prepared, put on a stone, he burns it up. You know, it's consumed by fire. But here, you still got a very human representation of God coming in. You know, this bowing down to the ground, you'll notice when Abram says, my Lord, if I find favor with you, that the L-O-R-D is not capitalized, because it's just the standard sir here. You'll notice up here at the top in the first one, L with the O-R-D, that's the name of God. Whereas here it's just sir, and it's just, he's just doing the normal Middle Eastern kind of welcome for a guest. Okay, we carry on through, and so the reason I did this is here we have the Rublev Trinity, which is essentially putting all the flesh on the Tyrannosaurus Rex. This is the interpreted story. All right, and here's a great one. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now we know we don't have any record from the Middle East for this, but there was a shrine in Italy in the ancient world where the priest would, where someone would go into the sacred precinct to receive a word from the god, and you had to wrestle the priest in order to do it. And only if you won would you get your message from the god. And if you killed the priest, you became the next priest. So this is not the same thing, but imagine, and in all of these stories in Genesis, there is a sense of ordeal. So whether it's a complicated one, like Abram when he sacrifices the animals and cuts them in half and lays them out on the ground, and then has to spend the day keeping the buzzards and the crows off of them. He's worked through the day, and it's at night that he receives the vision after that. Jacob lying on the ground, he sleeps in the sacred precinct and has the vision of the angels. Here, he wrestles a whole night with this guy. And it's only at the end he says, I've seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. But we can sense, I think, not that this is what they're trying to say in the story, but the story made sense to the people when it was first told, because they knew what it was like to go to a shrine and go through an ordeal of some sort. You know, you couldn't just go and say, hey, priest, what's going to happen? You had to fast or do something to suffer a little for. But here, God is present in a way where you can actually wrestle with it. But we also have the sense here that Jacob is someone who's been wrestling with God his whole life. You know, when the twins are born, Esau is born first, but Jacob's got him by the ankle because he wants to pull him back so he can be first. And of course, the strange thing about the story of Jacob is that he's promised the first place anyway, and he spends his whole life wrestling for something that's already his. But I love the story of Jacob. It's just great. So, but we begin to have within the story things that are symbolic as well as literal. So Jacob spent the rest of his life limping because of his hip. Jacob crippled himself with all of his attempts to control God. So here we have a story we're all familiar with. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the bush. So we're moving to what's probably a later, and this is just scholars assuming because we don't have dates, copyright dates on these books. But instead of the Lord, it's appearing in a flame of fire out of the bush. It's the angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord. Suddenly, throughout Exodus, we have a more distant view of God. God doesn't just walk in like a guy. God is God. Although we may see some layering in the way that this was written or put together, because the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the bush. But by the time he gets there, the Lord saw that he had turned aside, and God called to him out of the bush. So the story is a little unclear as to who's there. Is it the angel of the Lord, a messenger, or God himself? At any rate, instead of bowing down and saying, let me make your lunch, he hides his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And remember, in the Jacob story, whoa, I've seen the face of God, but I'm still alive. So God is beginning to become a more distant and dangerous figure. When Moses goes up Mount Sinai, the whole mountain's wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. And the smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln. while the whole mountain shook violently. And Moses brings the people to the foot of the mountain, but he says, you all can't set foot on the mountain. You'll be stoned to death if you do. And here's the thing that appears throughout Exodus, otherwise he will break out against them. And the idea of God breaking out, and this happens several times in the Exodus, where God is seen as living in the tent, in the tabernacle, and every once in a while God gets mad and breaks out. The power of God comes out and messes up a bunch of people. So you have God is dangerous, God is powerful, God is unpredictable. And up on the top, a ways down, a lot of Exodus is God dictating laws to Moses. And Moses says, show me your glory. And God says, I will make all my goodness pass before you and proclaim before you the name, the Lord. But you cannot see my face, for, remember Jacob, no one shall see me and live. Although we have a sense later on that God and Moses speak face to face, but here, so we have this wonderful thing, stand in the cleft in the rock, and I'll cover you with my hand, and then I will take away my hand, and you'll see. And it basically says my backside, but my face you shall not see. So we're having this development in the sense of who God is and what God is in relation to people. Think now about once moving into an entirely different way of seeing God, because up until now, it's in the midst of ordinary life that something happens. Whether it's God shows up as a guy, or Moses is sitting there and he looks over and that bush is on fire, and it's been on fire for a while and it doesn't look like it's going out. I wonder what's going on. And he walks over and God speaks. Well, here we have in Isaiah, the beginning of a kind of visionary view of God, because Isaiah of the priestly caste is in the temple. And in order to go into the temple, you had to be a priest or a Levite. There were restrictions on that because it was a dangerous place. The temple had 2 rooms, a big room and a little room, the holy place and the most holy place. And the little room was hidden from the rest of the temple, similar setup in the tabernacle, by a curtain. And the only time anybody went into that room where the Ark of the Covenant was stored was once a year on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went in with the blood of the sacrifice, which he dashed around the room. Now, after a while, that room must have been a mess. I wonder if maybe sometime during the year a Levite went in with a mop, but maybe not. But when he went in, the priest had bells on his vestments. It was to warn God that he was coming in, so he didn't surprise him. And he had a rope tied around his ankle in case God struck him dead, so they could haul him out of the dangerous place so they wouldn't have to go in and face the wrath of God to get the body out. This approach to the danger of holiness is something that kind of sticks with in different ways, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. In the Middle Ages, the heart of the Eucharistic prayer was called the most dangerous prayer, because the sense was if the priest up there slipped up, got inattentive, said the wrong word, God would be really ticked off, not only at the priest, but all of the people would then be receiving the Eucharist unworthily, if they were receiving, which they mostly didn't do because it was too dangerous. And they'd be in trouble too. But okay, here we have, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty. He's not here anymore. He's not coming up the hill to see me. He's not on the mountaintop where Moses can stand with him. He's not in the burning bush. He's high and lifted up above everything. Robe filled the temple. Seraphs. What are seraphs? We don't know. But some angelic beings are there. 6 wings covered their faces because you can't look at God. They covered their feet, which is a euphemism for the genitals, because you don't want to show the naughty bits to God. And then with 2, they flew. And the one called to another, and so they're singing the Sanctus the whole time. And the pivots of the threshold shook, the house filled with smoke, and he has this response to the presence of God. Woe is me, I am lost, a man of unclean lips, in the midst of the people, I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. This is a dangerous moment. But it's also this sense of the holiness of God emphasizes the lack of holiness of humanity. Someone was talking the other day about how they'd been to Niagara Falls. Think about what it's like if you've ever been to a major waterfall where you're standing next to all of that rushing water, all of that power. It can give you a feeling that you're not quite so powerful as you might have thought a few minutes before. Used to say that there are 2 kinds of people who go to the mountains. Those who go to the mountains so they can look down and think how big they are, and those who go to the mountains so they can look around and realize how small they are. And that second thing seems to be going on here. And out of this, the seraph touches his lips with a coal from the altar, and cleanses him, and Isaiah is commissioned. And the commission is really a very sort of ordinary human commission that comes out of this. Moving on, we get to Ezekiel. This is Isaiah. This is Isaiah on drugs. And here we have a vision, but it's also a story that's also a parable. Hand of the Lord came upon me, brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, set me down in the middle of a valley full of bones, led me all around them, and there were many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. Can these bones live? And we know the story. Prophesy and say to the bones, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And the bones come together, and flesh comes on them, and skin comes on them, but they're still dead. And it says, prophesy to the breath, to the wind, and the wind comes, and they're raised up a mighty host. And so you've got this really very disturbing story, but then it's got an interpretation. These bones are the whole house of Israel. Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We're cut off completely. Thus says the Lord God, I'm going to open your graves, bring you up from the graves of my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. So what we have is a story of a vision, but it's a vision that conveys a message. It is almost like it's a sermon rather than just a vision. Did he get carried off to a valley? Did he imagine this? Did he work up the metaphor of the dry bones? And then also the picture of God becoming less and less understandable. I looked, and there were 4 wheels beside the cherubim, each beside each cherubim. The appearance of the wheels was like gleaming beryl. And as for their appearance, the 4 looked alike, something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. And in whatever direction the front wheel faced, the others followed without veering as they moved. Their entire body, their rims and spokes, their wings, and the wheels of the 4 of them were full of eyes all around. What is going on here? What does that look like? What he's trying, I think, to say is that you've got these things that are moving fast, they're going in all directions, but they're unified. They're not limited by being in one place. They see everything. And so you've got these living beings that are rolling around. But God is somehow in the middle of it. But we're getting a God who is further and further away and more removed from visual images. You'll find that as you go along through the Old Testament as well, that there's a lot more moving from the Lord does this to the angel of the Lord does this to the angel appeared, because we're coming to what is perhaps a more sophisticated vision of God, but one that is a lot less like God as a sort of special God. And then we come to Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel, the entire Old Testament is written in the Hebrew language, except for the second half of the book of Daniel, which is written in Aramaic, the same language Jesus spoke. They're different dialects of Aramaic. Daniel's is probably from a couple of centuries before Jesus. But you have the first half of the book of Daniel, which is Daniel in exile and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and the fiery furnace and all of that. But the second half is a series of visions about Israel. Now, it's set back during the Babylonian captivity in its telling, but it probably speaks to what's going on when the successors to Alexander the Great, there were 4 lines. Alexander had no children, so he left his empire to 4 generals who each took a different part. And there was a period of conquest and persecution, an attempt to spread Hellenism, Greek thought, through the Mediterranean basin. There was a kind of evangelism for that under the successors of Alexander that led to the Jewish revolt under the Maccabees. And a lot of scholars think that this second half of the book of Daniel was written at that time, and the language of the visions is a hidden language, because if you're facing an oppressive, conquering government, you can't stand up in the middle of the thing and say, well, you know, those Greek guys are pretty nasty. You've got to hide it. So Paul is speaking in prayer. The man Gabriel, the man Gabriel, who I'd seen in a vision, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. So we're having the vision is delivered not by God, but by Gabriel, who we think of as the angel Gabriel, usually with nice big white wings. Daniel, I've now come to give you wisdom and understanding. So consider in the word and understand the vision. And I just have this here, 70 weeks are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Well, one of the things that happened with the Greeks, there was a guy who was in the line, the Antiochene line, descendants of Antiochus, who was one of the generals. Antiochus, and he liked to be called Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus, the manifestation of God. The Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes, Antiochus, the son of the dog. But he, once they had conquered, he went into the temple and erected an idol in there. He turned it into a pagan temple. So the Maccabean War was a war to reconquer Jerusalem, reclaim the temple, and purify it to the end of the transgression into sin, to anoint a most holy place. Okay. And this whole thing about 70 weeks, we get lots of things about time in apocalyptic literature. A week, 70 weeks, 40 years, 1,000 years. The question is, are things going to be this much time, or this much time, or this much time? Anybody here been to Curcio? at least in the Cursillos I attended in the old days, because you didn't have your watch, the way they would talk about time is they would say, we're going to have a break. It's going to last this long. Or we're going to take a break now and it's going to be this long. And biblical time, while they use numbers, you've got 1 day, 3 days, 7 days, 40 days, 1 year, 7 years, 40 years, 1,000 years, this much time, this much time, this much time. And then now I'll announce the truth to you. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. The fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a warrior king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases. And while he is still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven. Alexander's kingdom broken up among 4 generals, but not to his posterity. He didn't have a posterity, nor according to the dominion by which he ruled, and so on. So what we have in Daniel is an example of early apocalyptic literature. And as I say, there are other apocalypses that affect what we read. And here we have an appearance of God. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one, the Ancient of Days, as it used to be translated, took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels, the throne had wheels. Well, we're back to wheels. Burning fire. Fire issued and flowed out from his presence, God breaking out from the temple, served by a whole bunch of people. The court sat in judgment and the books were open. How many of us have thought of judgment being the opening of the book? Here you got it. Now, later we've got the book of life. I don't think this is the book of life we got here. This is Santa Claus's naughty and nice list. It's actually the naughty book that everybody's going to have to pay. So, and where are we right now? We are almost to the end of our hour. Next week, we'll begin to look at Apocalypse in the New Testament and perhaps open up the Revelation of John. But I wanted you to have a sense of how the idea of encounter with God developed, how a sense of unworthiness versus holiness and judgment being involved with that develops through the telling of the story in the Bible. Any last questions or comments?
Let's go back to Mary Magdalene for a second.
Yeah.
So her story was taken from 2 other Marys.
Well, they're not all Marys. No. Because you've got Mary Magdalene. There are 2 Marys. I mean, Miriam, the Bible is full of Miriams. I mean, it's like, you remember when people named their daughters Holly? The world was filled with little girls named Holly at one period. Well, we've got Marys all over the place. Mary, the mother of Jesus. There are several Marys listed in the New Testament. But in this, you've got Mary of Magdala, Mary of Bethany, and an unnamed prostitute who early in Jesus' ministry at the home of a Pharisee comes in, washes his feet, and you've got that whole story of, the Pharisee going, well, if he was a prophet, he'd know what she's like. And Jesus comes back with, I come in, you don't even show me the basic courtesy of offering me a chance to wash the dirt off my sandal feet. She has shown me hospitality.
Mary Magdalene didn't actually do that. It was prostitute.
Right. Well, no. It was the prostitute, the unnamed prostitute. Yeah. So what happened is, because the 4 Gospels give you 4 views of Jesus. And one of the earliest things that people, and it's a natural instinct, tried to do was to take the four gospels and make one story out of it. And so there's an early thing called a hexapla, which is an attempt to weave the gospels together. The difficulty is that as they were put together, some stories are used at the beginning of the gospel, they're used at the end in others, and they're told in different ways. In Matthew and Luke, Matthew, Jesus, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. Luke, blessed are, cursed are, blessed are, cursed are. So you have, if you're going to put them all together, you're going to have to do a little violence to the individual texts. But if the desire is to put them all together, and you've got to preach, and people don't have access to the text to do it themselves, you can mix and match, trade with your friends. It's like baseball cards. Well, we have, let us, rather than saying the wrong impression, because we're dealing with a tradition that's been there for a long time, we have a preaching tradition that, let us say, embroiders the biblical text. You know, the biblical text itself is something of a patchwork quilt. And we can get into that in detail another time. But the preaching tradition is more like a crazy quilt. Snip a bit here, snip a bit there.
Where in the Bible does it say about Jesus, stepping out the seven?
It's in either Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Yeah, I'd have to look it up. Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop the share and end the recording so it can start processing, because I'm going to have to get to the healing service in just a minute. But thank you all online, and we will see.